Hello, this is your Art Academy in another world, and while I don't have a traditional education in art, I've thought I'd put my knowledge that I have to help beginner artists that are struggling because my art journey was certainly a lot tougher due to having no real direction or art teacher. So let's just jump right into it. Just take a moment to look at the syllabus for today's video, trying to keep it college format. Now, some of you may wonder, why am I doing this for free? Well, to put simply, I understand the struggle of wanting to start art, but not having a proper art teacher, as I was not allowed to major in art and I was already in my early 20s. So despite where you are in life and your circumstances, I want to at least give a starting point to any artist looking to begin their journey. Beginners, when they start learning everything, especially when it comes to digital, the blank canvas can be really intimidating. So this is a general guide to help, but not something to follow to the T. It's just a rule of thumb and something I personally do for my pieces. It can be used to have a process to rely on as a starting point for newer artists, or for people struggling to figure out what they want to draw. You could say this is a video I wish I had for my younger art self, and I hope this could be of help to you, and consider subscribing if it does. Now let's get into the lecture. By the end of this video, you should have all the tools to make an art piece from start to finish, and you should feel less intimidated when you stare at that blank canvas. As you get more familiar with art, feel free to circle back to this video. Maybe when you come back, you'll have a greater understanding. Maybe by then, you skip some steps altogether as part of your creative process. Or maybe if you are stuck on art block, you'll remember me and this video to help unclog your brain. Now, before you even start thinking about picking up the pen, you should have a goal in mind. A goal will give you motivation to complete your artwork and keep you on the right track when making your piece. Goals can be as simple as your piece will only be to practice drawing a lot of skulls, or it will never be posted for anyone else to see. Or it could be a piece that is following a social media trend in order to gain more followers for your account. Maybe the piece will be part of a portfolio you are building to impress a certain art studio or company. Or maybe perhaps you are creating concept art for your own game idea. But I digress. Having a goal is important in helping decide the path of your piece. Now we move on to exactly what you want to paint. Going back to before, your goal should help give you a rough idea on what you want to draw in order to help fulfill that goal. It could range from fan art to just having fun, or painting an environment for a studio, a self-portrait to gauge your art level compared to previous self-portrait pieces, or figure drawings to improve anatomy. For example, my goal was to make an art piece for YouTube to show as an example for you guys, and I picked to do a fan art, so I did not have to focus too much on creating design and just focus on making a piece to display the points I want for this video. On a personal belief, I think some of the best art pieces can make you feel something while displaying technical skill. Integrating what emotion you want from those viewing your art to feel helps you create a more concrete idea on how you want to express your piece. What do you want someone to feel when they look at your piece? Think of a couple words to act as a guideline. Have you ever seen a piece that just feels sharp? Or maybe it makes you feel small? Perhaps awe, maybe powerful. I'm going to guide you guys with my own art piece from beginning to end. In the piece created for this video, the feeling I'm going to go for is distress and comedy. So, thumbnail sketches. These are just really small canvases that you can make on a single piece of paper. This is where you can get all your ideas out, from different poses to different compositions you want to try out. Also, since you are viewing these thumbnails from further away than you would on a full-blown canvas, you can see if your ideas will translate well for a regular sketch. Because if a piece is readable zoomed out, it will definitely be clear and concise once you sketch it out. It is a very low investment technique that many artists use everywhere. They barely need any details and can be as ugly and loose as you want, as you can see from my own thumbnails. So go wild. You also don't have to worry about drawing something for a while, only to not like the idea of it and toss it out just to start all over. As you can see here, I have 4 thumbnails done, but you can honestly do however many you want until one sits right with you. But I highly recommend to at least do 3 or 4 of them playing around with the canvas sizes as well. I happen to have all mine the same size due to me wanting it to fit the YouTube thumbnail. Once you've picked up your idea, you can now move on to your composition, which can be simply put as arranging the piece in an interesting way. Once you've picked up your idea, you can now move on to your composition, which can simply be put as arranging the piece in an interesting way. There are many ways to approach composition: deciding the perspective, deciding on how the object will draw the eye, what will be off focus, where is the lighting coming from, big, medium, small, the golden rectangle, rule of thirds, compositions. Like, there's literally lists out there of different compositions. Shapes and sizes, contrast, things going off the edge of the piece. Is there going to be a lot of items? Are you going to focus and arrange the lighting to focus on the subject only? Are you having a snake wrap around the subject matter? The positive and negative space. Will you use the negative space to make the subject matter feel small and insignificant, or will it be a simple portrait with a crazed expression? Size can equal power, so use that when you're making a piece. Maybe you're going to make a giant compared to a very small man. There is so much to consider, which is why thumbnails are so perfect to test it all out. While you're not fully invested into a sketch, think more of doodling. You can do additional thumbnails as well, and even color them for different moods. Deciding on how you compose your piece can end up taking a while unless you already have a good idea on what you want to do. Some artists like me can take a long time deciding what composition to do. Composition can be intimidating in its own right, but have no fear to see, as Google has plenty of composition ideas. However, you will often hear the rule of thirds and the golden ratio. While I cannot go over everything, I can certainly show you which ones I use in the drawing I did. In the composition, you can see me using the rule of thirds because 3 is a strong number. So I had a croissant, a plate, and our VTuber that we are doing fan art of, which is Fillion, who you can find on Twitch. I use pushing a subject matter off screen, such as the croissant, so it brings more interest to it, while keeping a mental note of intentionally blurring it near the end to force the eye to my main point of interest, which is Fillion. I also use a 1-point perspective because of the importance of Fillion's expression rather than the body. Having the croissant first but out of frame, then the plate second, and Fillion the third gave a sense of depth to the piece as well, as you can see here. But you do not have to simply use as many ideas as I did. Simplify it into using very little composition ideas. It all depends on what suits your needs for the piece you are creating. At this point, you should have a general idea of what you need in order to make your piece. Now you need to research and gather references. Shocking, right? But artists aren't wizards. Our brains, for the most part, are actually not very good at visualizing what we want to draw and how we want to draw it. I would say most artists use references, and many popular artists use references. So never feel ashamed for using one. If you are a beginner, I highly recommend creating a mood board. You can use Pinterest, Google, and other sources when creating your board. The board is a place you can easily look back to for, say, you want to recreate a certain texture of fur. You can pop your mood board and see the fur reference you saved. A mood is also there to help you draw inspiration when sketching your piece. Well, I personally use and create a mood board after my thumbnail and creating my composition. It is totally fine to make a mood board beforehand because they are very helpful in creating ideas to draw upon. Your mood board can contain other artists' artwork because maybe you like a certain artist's way of drawing eyes and you want to emulate that, or maybe you just need a reference point of someone's art style. Or maybe there's a pose that you liked a lot of like a certain person, maybe a model, and you want to use that as your reference for the character you are drawing. References are there to help because a lot of art is based off real life, so why wouldn't you use a reference? Your brain needs to build up a library and memorize these references in order to eventually draw them freely from the mind. Congratulations, you can begin sketching and working out any kinks and arrangements. I like to take the composition sketch that I felt was the strongest and just expand it and start working on it. This is where you start refining your piece, get your anatomy right, and using your references. Go through multiple sketches if you have to get your satisfactory look. I went through multiple iterations, as you can see here, until I was happy. Furthermore, when you go through multiple sketches, you may find there are elements that you want to add to the sketch. For example, rather than having Fillion's hair stay down, I wanted to have an emphasis on how fast she was falling. so I had her hair pushed far up instead. You can also have it very rough if you're a painter and render it later, but personally that is a more advanced. Bonus sketch tips. Don't forget to flip your canvas during this process because artists get sucked into staring at a single piece for a long time. When you flip the canvas, it resets your view and allows you to see if there's any wonkiness that needs to be fixed. A bonus tip to when you're redrawing each sketch is taking the previous sketch and turning down the opacity and coloring it red. You can do this by locking the layer and filling it in. I believe it's known as alpha lock. Does it have to be red? No, just whatever you're comfortable with. If you're doing this traditional, you can use a simple light box underneath your sketches and use colored pencil. There is no single correct way to do line art. It can range from being very loose and messy to extremely clean and precise. There is no single correct way to do line art. It can range from being very loose and messy to extremely clean and precise. Common problems people have is that the line art layer, which is supposed to be the cleaner, quote unquote, best layer, looks worse than the sketch. This happens because our brains like to piece things together. So subconsciously, due to the sketch having so many lines, it picks the best ones to interpret to put together the most pleasing image in our heads. Picking out the best lines can be difficult, especially if you only do one passing of the sketch. A way to alleviate the problem is to make multiple sketches, as I mentioned before. You will notice that the lines of your piece will get more and more precise with each passing iteration. It will begin to look more solid and put together as you refine it until you can finally do your line art layer. While this is not a line art video, some basic generic tips for line art is thickening lines where parts overlap, thinning out parts of the piece that goes more into the background, and to have line variation because a single line type of width is going to look more boring to look at unless you are doing animations which focus more on movement of characters and cannot afford to focus on changing line widths with every single frame. What are flats, you say? Well, say you did your thumbnail sketching, composition, and make a beautiful line art, and you finally go to color your piece, and for some reason, it just does not look right. Maybe you did not take the time to set up your colors. A mistake I see a lot of beginners make when they start coloring is using a white canvas. Sounds crazy, right? But in reality, the white canvas is throwing off your sense of lighting and colors. First of all, white is just bright and it hurts my eyes. Secondly, if you begin painting and putting in the colors that you want to be there on the white canvas, it just won't pop the way you want it to because it is being compared to the white of the canvas, which is basically the brightest color, or well, technically white's not a color, but the brightest color you can compare it to. However, if you start with a color that is more mid-toned or falls into more of the middle of the color scale wheel spectrum, and then you add the bright color, you will get that contrast you want. Now, I personally recommend before you color your subject matter, you pick a mid-tone background, typically correlating to the general idea of your piece. Maybe the character you have is in a forest, so I would personally choose a muddy green color as a background because it is not too bright and not too dark, but that's just an example. In the piece here, I picked gray because I wanted to focus bigger on the contrast from the lighting that will go into my character in the piece. I was not too concerned with colors at this stage of the drawing. As for the flats, go ahead, pick what colors you think each piece should be. I highly recommend that you do not make them too bright or too dark. I also especially recommend if you are a digital artist to keep them underneath your line art layer by creating a new layer and putting it just underneath it. I also suggest keeping each color to its own layer as it makes it easier to shade and just add all the lighting later. Once that is all done, you can look and marvel at your colors. If you feel like certain colors are too dark, too bright, you can use the tone curve tool or whatever lighting adjustment tool you have in your program to change that tone to whatever you feel is more appropriate. So a technique I like to use to make a piece overall seem more cohesive or in sync is washing the piece. A lot of traditional artists like to use this. It gives a common point of color shared between all parts of the painting. I color picked the gray background with my color dropping tool. Then I used a brush that has some opacity to it and lightly glazed the piece with the gray color. This could also be done by messing around with the color balance of the flats, and which you can see on the right side, which I choose to use incorporate more red. As you can see, the whole piece is now influenced by the color red with the color balance tool, but I'm personally sticking to gray. Now, with your flats being complete, you are ready for the next step, which is shading. So shading can be very complex, but it can add a lot of detail and information to your piece. There are many ways to go about it, but I'm going to show you the simplest way for beginners. You want to pick a main light or the light that is affecting the piece the most, or even better, have a reference ready of a real life lighting scenario that you like. Figure out what parts that are being lit in the piece and which parts of the pieces that are going to be cast in the shadow. Many people like to use multiply for this process, but I feel this does not help much for you to understand how to shade as much. When you are shading, you want to decrease the value of the color you pick, increase the saturation, and move the color wheel toward a cooler direction. Cooler colors being the range of like green to blue and violet and all that jazz. And you do not have to move them drastically, just a little bit. As you can see here, I give an example. I highly suggest using a clipping mask, which can be done by making a new layer on top of your colored layer and clipping it to the bottom layer. It makes it so you can paint on top without having to worry about going out of the lines. Occlusion shadows are essentially the parts of the piece where the light has the hardest time reaching. As you can see here, I do not put it in many areas. It is not meant to be used so heavily. Of course, it depends on the mood you want to achieve and the type of lighting you want to use. But in general, with subjects in light where the occlusion shadows are usually the darkest, it should be used sparingly to achieve that nice contrast. Lighting is where life really begins to being breathed into your piece. In real life, we are lit up by many lights. Unfortunately, it is not as simple as thinking of one direction of light for us to be lit. So we'll be focusing on main lights, reflective and bounce lights, and secondary lighting. But when you are starting off with art, it is best to not be caught up by adding a lot of lighting because it can be really confusing. By lowering the saturation, increasing the value or brightness, and moving the wheel towards warmer colors, which is like in the yellow orange range. Of course, there are main lights that could be red or blue or whatever color you enjoy, but that's honestly a different topic, and main lighting could be those colors very well, much so. But this is just a good rule of thumb for adding brighter colors to your piece in general. While I go in and paint over the duller areas with the light because I like the textures, there are other ways that go into your main flats and just increasing the brightness or tone from there with your tone curve tool or the color adjustment tool. How smooth you want the transitions between the light is entirely up to you. I did not add too much to the clothing. For the hair, I added a light as a stylistic choice rather than increasing the brightness of the area lit. Now, reflective lights are simply the lights that bounces off the surfaces, for example, the ground, and it hits the subject. You may have seen art pieces where there is only one source of light, yet they are lit by the opposite direction of the light source. This is not a coincidence. It is why, even though you can see people sitting in the shade on a sunny day, you can still see them clearly. While they are not being hit directly by the sun, they are still being lit by all the surfaces being hit by the light, like the pavement, the street signs, and so on and so forth. The light is also affected by the color of the surface it is hitting. If you have ever seen tennis players with white clothing out in the sun, you may notice some green on their clothing. That is because the light is bouncing off the green pavement and hitting the white clothing. In the case of my piece, I do not have any surface to use to do a very convincing reflective light, but I will pretend like I did and act like there's something green, like a tennis court underneath her fall. The reflective light typically will not be as strong as the main light source and will often hit areas that could have been shaded. When you're applying it, you should be thinking of how you can use this lighting to help enhance your subject matter or use it to define your details you normally would not be able to do with normal lighting. There is a video with how colors interact with each other by Marco Bucci, which I will link below, that is very helpful when applying colors and lighting. But a tip beginners can use is to pick the color that is going to reflect under the subject matter and then reduce the opacity of the layer. And remember, reflective lights have their own points of highlights. It is not just applying one color. Try to manipulate how hard you press with an opacity brush to get different levels of saturation to show how hard light is hitting certain areas. Secondary lighting is any light that is not your main light. A lot of artists use this to make cool lighting scenarios or to help further define their piece. Just adding a secondary light can make your subject matter a lot more interesting, and it helps give it more life. I chose the color blue as my secondary light because blue complements the white background I had in my head. The secondary lighting is a powerful but flexible tool. This is more of a style preference, but I like to pick a more saturated bright color for my secondary light. I even increase the saturation value and move the color towards a warmer color to achieve a more poppy bright. Now, you may have heard rendering somewhere before. It is a word that is thrown around like a lot in the art community. When I was a beginner artist, I didn't understand it that much. But when artists refer to rendering, it typically means they are going to like clean up the piece and oftentimes painting over the piece to give it more definition, usually to fix proportions, paint over things they didn't like on the piece, sharpening up certain shadows and lights, or maybe softening them. Adjusting certain colors. There are artists that have very rough sketches and lay down general blobs of color underneath and begin rendering right away into like a more polished piece. It's very good for giving a more realistic look to pieces, and I would say it falls more to the realism side of art. But it's really a preference. In my case, I fixed up Villian's eyes, added some teeth, simplified the tongue, added the tears of despair, and change the lighting scenario and played around with her overall tone. You can usually combine all the previous layers and then render it, but keep up a backup copy just in case. I then decide to spray in some white light to give dynamic lights like they do in anime to capture like a certain stillness in a moment. I also painted in the croissant because when it comes to food, it is easier to just paint it than compared to people, in my opinion. So I left it forward as the last thing I needed to do because, well, it doesn't have any line art. As you can see, the rendering process can look quite different from what you have been building up, which is why a lot of advanced artists are more concerned of big shapes in the beginning and to have a good base to work with, because by the end they can add all the tiny details they want in the rendering process. Now, are we finally done yet? No. Now, you had to take a long deserved day break before going back to the piece. This is going to give you time to have a fresh set of eyes for your piece. When you go back, you can see what other flaws you want to fix and make some more adjustments until you are finally done. Now, if you enjoyed the video or felt like it helped you, please consider subscribing, as I plan on releasing more videos like this in the future. If you felt like I missed something or you feel like you did not understand something in the video, feel free to leave a comment below. I also have a Patreon where I give more in-depth guidance and personal feedback for my patrons. That includes a Patreon-only Discord for those who want to journey together of those of a similar mind. And for the last slide, this is just a credit slide for the template that I used. I thought it was very nice, so of course I'm going to credit where credit is due, because you should do that as a fellow artist. Hope you had a great educational experience. I hope I didn't bore too many people, and I hope you have a good day.